Here we go. Hi, everybody. Welcome to the OT Association's presentation of Staying Exterior to Political Chaos. We're here to share some ideas and concepts about LRH techniques that you can use to stay a little calmer during election season. If some of you don't know, we do have presidential elections coming up on November 5th. And it's a very exciting time right now. We've got a lot going on, but it can also be a little interpolating. So Randy Smith and Trey Lotz are going to be speaking today about staying exterior to political chaos. Just as there we go. Let me see. A little starter here. Hold on. Okay. Where you excuse me, if you are curious about who we are and what we do, the OT Association is a group of 7 OTs who got together 2 years ago to create a third dynamic experience for independence. And you can reach us at indiebridge.org. That's our website, and we keep our events and other information current on there. If you'd like to email us, info@indiebridge.org. If you've got questions, suggestions, email us. Okay. We really like to talk to people. We are a resource for verified and qualified auditors. So if you need an in-person or remote auditor, we can help you with that. Okay. We've already connected quite almost 10 people with appropriate auditors so far. And we can also hook you up with training if you're interested in that. On Facebook, we are Indie Bridge. It is a private group. It is not publicly searchable, but just email info@indiebridge.org for an invitation if you would like. Let's see here. All right, our next OTA event, just a little ad here, is increase certainty and ability and apply them to life. That's Saturday, November 16th at 10 a.m. Pacific time. All right, here's our event now, Staying Exterior to Political Chaos, an Indie Bridge event produced by the OT Association. So I'm going to hand it over to Trey Lotz, who's going to be doing our our first information. Remember to participate. You can type your question or win in the chat. You can message privately, or you can raise your hand. Do that at any time. The OT Association is composed of Trey Lotz, OT 8, Class 9 and ELS Auditor, Randy Smith, OT 7, Class 9 Auditor and CS, Z Snyder, OT 8, Class 5 Grad and an Auditor, Jerry Tunadal, OT 8, Class 9, also an Auditor and a CS in training, Ingrid Hoffman, who is here today, OT 8, Dianetics Auditor, and more, and Greg Cohen, OT 8, Class 2. I'm the OTA chair. That means I just chase down the paperwork, okay? And your MC, Mary Blackford. I'm OT 6, currently on Solonauts in Class 2. All right, let's get rolling here, folks. Today's speakers are Trey Lotz and Randy Smith.
Hello, everybody. The first step in staying exterior to political conflict is to have a broad understanding of what politics are and what causes conflict. So in order to really get an understanding and an exterior view of the subject, it's important to know what politics are because they apply in a lot of areas of life other than governmental conflict. So here's a couple of definitions. In the admin dictionary, politics is the study of ideal social organization, the total complex of relations between men in society. So, of course, that could apply to a church group. It could apply to a family. It could apply to any kind of a sports team. There's always politics involved in that respect. Um, and the other another definition, sorry, another definition from the Tech Dictionary was optimum conditions and processes of leadership and govern group relations. So uh, politics is often or most often a struggle for leadership. Who is going to have power in a group and an influence and who is not. And so you can see how that would apply um, even when you're not electing a leader, you still have people jockeying for position in relationship to other people. And this is generally considered to be politics. From the Cobill Dictionary, the way power is achieved in a country or a society is the definition of politics. So how do you achieve power? In totalitarian societies, power is achieved by who's most brutal. And in a democracy, it's achieved by who gets the majority support and agreement. Another part of that definition, the actions or activities concerned with achieving and using power in a country or society. So again, the question becomes who's in power? And the third part of that would be a person's politics are their beliefs in how a country should be governed, or what kind of um, leadership you should have, or who's the best person to lead. Now, Randy is going to cover that a little bit later in terms of how to pick leaders. But I wanted to emphasize that politics exists in groups, even when you don't elect a leader. Go to work for a company, it's got a president and you've got a boss and you've got other people. Um, and you still have jockeying for power, relatively speaking, within the organization. And you see this in families too. See what is the org board of a family? Who's on top of the org board? And sometimes it's the dog. So. Another thing to understand is just what is a society? It says um, relations between men and society. Well, society is the people who live in a region or country thought of as a large organized group, their attitudes and values. And so again, politics is has to do with um, uh, well, I'll get into this a little bit more, but it has to do with getting agreement on values and attitudes, which then lead to conclusions about who you want to run things. So you can kind of see that it's a broader subject than who are we going to elect, because if you start arguing about that, that conclusion is based on a large number of assumptions which are never inspected, in fact, by the individual himself. He'd be very hard to explain what are his assumptions about society and what causes things and what the future holds, et cetera, et cetera. But they'll tell you their conclusions, but not their premises. So if you're arguing about conclusions, it often is fruitless because there's so much underlying logic behind it or illogic behind it that you never really get to the bottom of it. Another important thing to keep in mind in terms of politics is that 80% of the population are social personalities. Now, a social personality is usually generally thought of as a person who's friendly, polite, social personality. But in terms of the relationship of the individual with society, it would be a person who supports the institutions that form a workable society. They would support workable families. They would support workable laws. They would support workable government institutions, workable hospitals, workable healthcare, um, workable church groups, neighborhood groups, all the things that a society is made up of. You would have 80% of the people basically want these things to do well or improve. Oh, you get 20% that are antisocial, and what that is their ideas are destructive to the very institutions that form society. It's destructive to families, or destructive to democratic norms, or you can you can probably think of a lot of different things. But that's and how you stay exterior to an antisocial personality is different than um, having discussions or arguments with a social personality. Because with a social personality, you can usually look at some more basic ideas that you can get agreements on. Like if you're looking at it in terms of an admin scale, um, you've got arguments about policy or plans. Well, I plan to do this, or this is what I think the policy should be. But a policy is only important because it furthers a purpose. But if the purpose is uninspected, then you're arguing about a conclusion rather than a premise. And uh, it's important to keep in mind that social personalities usually have social goals. So it's possible to discuss uh, political situations with people without getting into conflict or uh, real enemy type uh, dialogue. With an antisocial personality, it's a lot more difficult. So with an antisocial personality, it's best to just, as LRA says, you acknowledge what they say. You just don't have to agree with what they think. You can hold your own, you keep your own counsel and make your own decisions, but you can just not get involved because it immediately gets into the bank. Of course, everybody's got a bank, and the bank tends to promote conflict. So once the tone level of the conversation drops, it immediately keys in reactive mechanisms that are present in all GPMs. So the other person becomes an enemy rather than just somebody who has a different point of view. And that's very important because if you keep in mind that the guy you're discussing things with has a different point of view, and in sorting out the relative data and relative importances that you have with them, often it's possible to come to some sort of a agreement about disagreement. Like we both agree that we want a prosperous society with economic opportunity, but we disagree about how to get there. And if you really go into it, you can look at what's been tried in the past and what has good stats and what does not have good stats. But that's just and you can if you do that, you can stay analytical in your discussion. Um, the other really important thing about any kind of political discussion is keeping in the calm cycle, um, because what opens the door to reactive interaction is an outcome cycle. Once you start interrupting the other person, contradicting them, auditor code violations, inval, eval, personal attacks, then you that walks you right into the enemy pattern. And then you just get interpolated, the other guy gets interpolated, and it never goes anywhere. It takes you a couple of days to get over it. So anyway, that's sort of the overall view of how to um, understand the broader context of what politics is in order to just maintain an exterior viewpoint where you can participate. Doesn't mean that you see, some people solve this by not participating at all. They say, well, I don't care about politics. Politics doesn't affect me. Well, that's a lie. Politics affects everybody. I mean, it's also true that the vast majority of your life is under your own control. You don't necessarily control what laws are passed or how laws are enforced or how laws are interpreted by the institutions that are run the country. But most of the things in your life you have control over. So one of the things that people get into when they get into a reactive interaction is they what do you call it, demonizing the other guy. So the other guy becomes not just somebody that you have a difference of opinion about or different data about or different assumptions about. He becomes like the devil or, worse than Hitler or something like that, must be destroyed. So you can tell if you're talking with somebody, do they have an intention to sort things out with you and to maybe have a stimulating conversation, or they just want to destroy you, because you know and they say this, well, if the Republicans get in, we're all doomed, or if the Democrats get elected, this is the complete destruction of our country. So, so this is all nonsense. The old saying goes, nothing ever turns out as good or as bad as you think it might be. So it's good to keep that in mind. The next important point is the definition of a game. Because a society, if you look at society or family or a organization as a game consists of purposes, freedoms, and barriers. Now, an optimum game has worthwhile purposes, agreed upon freedoms, and agreed upon barriers. Um, the political spectrum is really a spectrum of gradient gradients between no rules and all rules. An authoritarian dictatorship is a society with all rules. Way too many rules. I was talking to one of my PCs from Venezuela. He said, "Oh, the first thing they do when they get into power is they pass all these laws, not because they care about laws, but they pass so many laws that you cannot function in their society without breaking laws. So if you start to give them trouble in any way, they can have a legitimate, quote, way of arresting you and putting you in jail or somehow silencing you because you've broken one of their laws. So that's a society with all laws. Society with all freedoms is also called anarchy. That means nobody follows any rules. And if you've ever driven in a city where nobody follows the the driving rules, you know what that's like. Nobody likes that either. That's the spectrum. Most social personalities, they want society to improve, so they want better rules. And they might disagree about what better rules are, but that is their general intention. An antisocial personality either wants they fall into more extreme views. They either want all rules or no rules. They want a police state or they want a total um, you know, total chaotic, no rules society, total freedom. So no, neither one of those things is workable. Uh, and that brings us to another important point about democracy. And like I was saying before, democracy is dependent upon majority agreement. In our democracy here, there's majority rule by representation, which is what a republic is, and at the same time, the protection of minority rights, not minority ethnically, but the minority opinion, the majority opinion, the minority opinion. That's what the Bill of Rights is, freedom of speech, freedom of religion. So you can have a minority religious view or political view, and you still have a right to have that. Um, so anyway, in a democracy, one of the big sources of argument between people, because a democracy is based on group agreement, what a lot of conflict is involved in is trying to get the other person to agree with you. Um, because in the end, we all have one vote. We vote this way or that way. Nobody has any more than one vote. I mean, hopefully. But uh, if you can, so that leads right into the subject of PR. And PR is uh, some definitions there. Persuade, think, others. The object of PR is to persuade, to think either newly or differently, or to keep on thinking the same way, a technique of creating states of mind, different types of audiences or publics. PR can be used or abused. It's a partial definition, but another good definition I found in a dictionary, it's a method of achieving agreement and cooperation with a course of action. So the leaders of a company want to use PR in order to get agreement and cooperation from their employees, and vice versa. The employees want to get agreement and cooperation from the leaders. So there's an interchange, and there's an ability to communicate, which affects the reality of the person you're communicating with. One of the differences between an antisocial personality and a social personality is a social personality is more or less open to information or facts or data, which can sometimes modify your views or viewpoints. Um, an antisocial personality is rarely open to any new ideas. They're mostly entirely fixed ideas. So again, that's why it's completely futile to argue with somebody who's, just basically, operating on antisocial fixed ideas, because they're never going to change their viewpoint no matter what facts are presented. And this whole thing is also modified by the fact that the reactive mind, the R6 bank, contains in it all kinds of aberration on the third dynamic. If you want to know what are the aberrations of the R6 bank, um, it's a fascinating point, but if you look at the policies that LRH wrote when he was researching the R6 bank, those policies are in place in order to restrain the dramatizations that are prompted by the reactive mind. So if you see a policy, you say, well, what dramatization this policy meant to restrain? And those would be reactive dramatizations. So, so it's important to understand that as well. That politically, when people keep trying, or individually or politically, when people keep trying to do the same thing over and over and over again, even though it's never worked and never has any stats, it means that is being driven by a bank computation. It's coming from the reactive mind. And again, because it's never inspected that way, it never changes or blows. So, uh, so that brings us to the PR. PR, getting somebody to agree with you so that you can get a majority opinion and get things done that you want to get done. Or the other side of PR is, of course, black PR. So you can either make your side well thought of, or you can make the other side thought less of, and that's a black PR campaign. And in politics, and particularly in national politics, but it occurs anywhere. It's like you try to run the other guy down, so by comparison, your guy looks better. And uh, that's why you can't just believe you can't just believe everything you hear in the media, especially when it's below 2.0 on the tone scale, because it's likely to be some sort of black PR campaign that's being run on whoever they consider the opposition to be. So anyway, that gets us into uh, the subject of information, how to choose a leader, and I want to turn it over to Randy, who has a lot to say about that subject.
Well, thanks, Trey. Yeah, very useful stuff. And so, one thing to consider when you're trying to choose a leader, like a political candidate, is how do you know what's a valid source of information? We hear so much in the media about different things and different people giving opinions about who's good or who's bad or what uh, political party is good or bad or what kind of government is good or bad or who should you vote for, et cetera, et cetera. So how do you tell? Well, LRH developed technology on this when he developed false data stripping, which is a technology developed in 79. And he found that when people are having trouble learning to do something, it's very often false definitions in their way, but it can also be false data. Someone who, quote, knows something tells someone else a definition or a datum, and the person now thinks he knows the definition, even though nothing in the field may make any sense to him. The word may not even read on the meter during misunderstood word checks because the person, quote, thinks he knows. So there is no field in all the society where false data is not rampant. Experts, advisors, friends, families seldom go and look at the basic texts on subjects, even when these are known to exist, but indulge in all manner of interpretations and even outright lies to seem wise or expert. Okay? So example, politician is told by an advisor, it doesn't matter how much money the government spends, it's good for the society, unquote. The politician uses this rule, and the next thing you know, inflation is driving everybody to starvation and the government to bankruptcy. The politician, knowing he was told this on the very best authority, does not spot it as false data, but continues to use it right up to the point where the angry mob standing up in front of a firing squad and shoot him down. And the pity of it is that the politician never once suspected there was anything false about the data, even though he couldn't work with it. So going on about this, false data on a subject can come from any number of sources. In the process of day-to-day living, people encounter and often accept without inspection all sorts of ideas which may seem to make sense but don't. Advertising, newspapers, TV, and other media are packed with such material. The most profound false data can come out of texts such as Stanislavski, a Russian actor and director, and even mothers have a hand in this. When a subject such as art contains innumerable authorities and voluminous opinions, you may find that any and all textbooks under that heading reek with false data. Those who have studied study tech will recall that the validity of texts is an important factor in study. Therefore, it's important that any supervisor or teacher seeking to use false data stripping must utilize basic workable texts. These are most often found to have been written by the original discoverer of the subject, and when in doubt, avoid texts which are interpretations of somebody else's work. In short, choose only textual material which is closest to the basic facts of the subject, and avoid those which embroider upon them. It can happen if you do false data stripping well and expertly without enforcing your own data upon the person, that he can find a whole textbook false, much to his amazement. In such a case, locate a more fundamental text on the subject. Examples of false text, Eastman Kodak. Now that's very surprising, right? One of the developers of the camera, but apparently the text LRH determined is full of false data. Lord Keynes, treatises on economics. He was a economist in the 1920s or 30s, I believe, that has influenced a lot of political opinion on how to run an economy. John Dewey's text on education. He was an early educator. False data. Sigmund Freud's text on the mind. the text derived from the, quote, work of Wundt, Leipzig, 1879, father of modern psychology, and Joke, a textbook on proper conduct for sheep, written by A. Wolf. So these are most often found to have been written by the original discoverer of the subject, in other words, valid texts. And when in doubt, avoid texts which are interpretations of somebody else's work. In short, choose only textual material which is closest to the basic facts of the subject, and avoid those which embroider upon them. So those are, I think, very useful principles to keep in mind when you're trying to evaluate data that you get from social media, especially these days, on political candidates. Remember what Trey went over about black PR. Many of these are motivated by trying to smear the opposition candidate. And then, so how do you determine a valid source of data? Well, one way is to look at, and Trey mentioned this a little bit earlier, has this kind of activity that is being recommended, does it have any statistics? We've done other seminars on using statistics before, but that's a pretty good way to look at it. Like, has this method of politics, this method of government, how has it performed in history? You know, some of them that have been performed, you take a really good look at it, and it may have participated in the murder of millions of people. Others may have promoted more freedom and opportunity for people. So there are certain criteria like that you can use to evaluate types of government and what a candidate really represents. Another thing about a candidate now, political candidates can espouse, they can claim to support various viewpoints or various actions. Good idea to look at their own statistics as well. How did they perform in the past? Did they achieve anything similar to what they're claiming that they support? Or is it all a bunch of hot air, you know? So those are a few things that can be used to rise above the ordinary antagonisms and conflicts that can come up in political discourse. And I hope that that is of some use to you.
Very good. Well, I wanted to touch a little bit more on the three elements that compose a society, and what is the use of power in any kind of a group. I mean, again, you can see this in a family or in a government. There's three things that need to be done in a government. Is like, one, make rules, two, enforce rules, and three, interpret rules. You could also say laws. So the brilliance of our democracy and our Constitution is that the interpretation of laws is its own branch of government, the judiciary. The making of laws is its own branch of government, which is Congress. And the enforcement of laws is its own branch, which is the executive division. So when societies get into trouble is when all three of those functions are in the hands of one person. Because if you're making the laws, interpreting the laws, and enforcing the laws, then it becomes a matter of, personal opinion and whim, and I'm gonna enforce laws that I like, and I'm not going to enforce laws I don't like, and so therefore the whole structure of a society tends to crumble and just become a one-man rule. And personally, what guides me in my own decision making about picking who should be in power and what kind of rules, I always look at, well, what is LRH? What kind of policies does LRH has he written? Particularly, I think in the area of how an org is run financially. And then I would tend to support policies that are promoted in a way that result in the financial viability of any group. Ellery talks about John Maynard Keynes, and he was the one who started this whole idea of deficit spending, which has gotten us into whatever we've gotten into at this point. And eventually those chickens come home to roost sooner or later. I mean, could be way later. People have been predicting some sort of debt collapse ever since the 70s. I remember reading books about it back in 1972, and it's one of these things that's never really been that bad. But on the other hand, it certainly violates policy, and org would never be run that way. So that's why I think, and I mean, Scientology itself, in way orgs are run, are fairly on the conservative side, whereas LRH's social policy was really more on the liberal side. So you can't really pin any particular political belief on Scientology, and I know Scientologists that are on all shades of the spectrum. But one of the things when I'm at big cognitions when I was studying philosophy in college is that everybody has a philosophy. And the fact that people cannot even begin to tell you what their philosophy is doesn't mean they don't have it. It's these uninspected and unknown assumptions about life and how it works that they then derive their decisions about how to proceed in life. So one of the reasons I really love doing admin scales on people is it evokes out of the person's universe a more clear-cut view of how they actually view life. And it's not the imposition of any exterior viewpoint. It's what is inherent in how the person looks at things. So some of the underlying concepts that govern how a person looks at life, how a person looks at life will govern where they fall on the political spectrum. For example, how much tolerance of risk does a person have? Well, if you're over this way on the political spectrum, you'll tolerate more risky changes and more risky policies. And if you're over here, you want to more or less hold on to what has been shown to at least work somewhat in the past, and you'll be a lot more reluctant to change. So tolerance of risk, tolerance of change. Some people don't want to ever change anything. Other people want to change everything right away. And that's extremely destabilizing. And of course, never changing anything just means that society is in a fixed idea or a stuck idea. And that doesn't work either. So again, the middle ground is tolerance of change, tolerance of some risk, but not too much. So another difference is this I thought that was very interesting. I was reading a book by Thomas Sowell called Conflict of Visions, and it's all about this. What are the underlying assumptions that govern what a person's political ideas are? And again, I want to emphasize it's political in any kind of a group, a family, a friend, a group of friends, whatever. It's assumptions about the future. Now, one school of thought tends to think that the future, the time track is always going towards a better society or more justice. It's like Obama said, when he was president, he said the arc of history always bends towards justice. Well, that's a belief. The other belief is a little bit more of a conservative view is, yes, things may get better, but don't count on it. So that's more the biblical belief, really, where in the Bible you have 7 lean years and 7 fat years. And if you look at the last 100 years, that's kind of worked out. You know, you've got a big boom in the 20s, and then a big depression in the 30s, and then um, and it kind of goes back and forth like this. Now, in Scientology, we have different answers to these things because if a society yo-yos between danger and affluence, it just means they're not applying the danger or affluence formula, which is very typical of people. Um, and again, it shows the influence of the reactive mind because the reactive mind says, oh, you have an affluent splurge, spend it all, borrow money because the future is bright, and infinitely bright. So we can have trillions of dollars of deficits because things will only get better and who cares? Or, maybe just kind of like, it's the old story of the grasshopper and the ant. The the ants put away things for the winter and the grasshoppers don't. But if you consider that uh, that all these things fluctuate, the political spectrum fluctuates, the economy fluctuates, you can be prepared for different things that come up. So that's one worldview. Like, um, how do you tolerate these different things? Um, yeah. So that's really kind of comes down to the fact again why um, if you have a larger view of what politics is, you can have a broader view of what political discussions are, and therefore have a better grasp on how to have political discussions, whether it's within a group or a family or a government, without getting into bank destructive Eve perp type uh, buttons that get pushed because people, when they disagree, if it goes down tone, it tends to get into conflict, and that gets into the GPM bank. And people are
Eh,
susceptible to this all over the place, and you see it very often. Uh, so I just think that
Trey,
what?
oh, real quick, would a discussion on pan-determinism be applicable right now? I think
Yeah, well, that's
we
what
had that as
pan-determinism
a,
is you can
yeah, let's
you
pull
can
that in
have a
there.
position, but it doesn't mean you demonize the other guy. You can grant beingness to the other side. But I think that's what it means in practice. You can discuss something with somebody without making them the enemy and somebody that has to be destroyed. Uh, that's what pan-determinism is. I mean, you could be exterior to the whole thing and say, well, like I say, both sides are wrong. Well, that doesn't get you out of having to be responsible for, is there a better side or not better side? You still have to make a choice. If you get totally if you totally withdraw from politics of all kinds, it just means you're withdrawing from groups. You just become an only one, an individual, and that's not good for anybody, including the person becoming the individual. So I think it's possible to navigate this area, uh, in a rational, sane way that doesn't result in upset and in turbulation. Uh, and anyway, yeah. So, if you follow some of these basic principles, you can maintain affinity, you can share realities, you can be willing to communicate and keep in the calm cycle, you can follow the auditor's code. And therefore, you can stay friends with people who don't agree with you politically, um, rather than breaking up relationships or families or friendships because they see things differently. And that's one of the great tragedies of life is people can't stay out of these traps. But this is how you do it. You just maintain calm cycle, maintain affinity, share realities, try to operate on facts, And that'll do it.
Very good points, Trey. Yeah,
Thank you, Trey.
yeah.
I have a question from Tony Zile. He raised his hand. Tony, be sure to unmute yourself. And what do you have to say?
Well, I accidentally pushed the wrong button. I was going to put the hooray, hooray to what Trey was saying. It was like,
Oh, okay.
so,
Easy to do.
and then I
Okay,
got,
all right.
sorry. Nope. Okay.
Okay, I have something occurred to me as Trey was talking, as Randy was talking. When I was an English professor, we would make assignments and we would pose a question or ask students to compare or contrast or argue a position on something. And frequently there'd be opposing ends to the topic that we were on. The students who wrote the best papers, and I really admired them, didn't take one side or the other side unless they were asked to, but would look at both sides and come up with a third position and a new position to argue from. And those were the students who usually got A's because they thought out of the box. Hey, we could solve this by, or what about this over here? They entertain new ideas rather than just digging in on the old ones. So just as a retired English professor, that's, that I see what Trey is saying. Look at all of the sides and then state what you need to. Okay, Tony, did you really raise your hand this time, Tony?
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Okay. Yes, you can. Thank you.
So I was trying to look up earlier the root and origin and the concept of politics, political, and all that. Like, between my fingers hitting wrong buttons, I didn't quite get that complete. Anyway, uh there's of the people, and the people is the polis, and then there's another definition I quickly glanced at was the people and the government. And you might want to give us more on the concept of the word. That's all.
Randy, Trey, would you like to weigh in on that? Thank you. Thank you, Tony.
Yeah. Go ahead, Randy.
Well, I think that sort of covers it. Thank you, Tony. That the origin of the word politics, and probably good to remember that that is the basis of when we say politics or political, we're talking about of the people, or that famous expression, by the people, of the people, for the people, That's really what it's all about. And it should probably weigh heavily in evaluation of, well, what's really good for people? What's really good for the majority of people, in making any major decision?
Yeah.
And yeah, another thing that may go along with that, and we have a slide on this that Mary has done, it's about institutions that support a workable society.
Okay, let me see what I got here.
It comes right after pandeterminism, I think. Yeah.
Okay.
These are things like good health care, agreed upon laws, agreed upon norms and freedoms, good education systems, support of creativity and production, stable families, and a safe environment to operate in, free speech, and an honest media. So that's a really good summary of institutions that support a workable society.
Okay. Tony raised his hand too. Shall we let it, Randy, did you have more to say,
No,
or shall I let
that's
Tony
fine.
go?
That's fine.
Thank you. Okay.
So I was just throwing in the reality level of a group of people, country, state, organization versus, not just versus, but here's my reality. It may go along with the others on a lot of things, but it may not. And I've just recently learning that from the ARC, opportunity, reality, and communication. For some reason, with Randy's help, I'm opening up these things. That's it.
Good. Very good. Maybe we should open it all up now to wins and so forth. Mary, what do you think?
I think it's as good a time as any. We've got it's 10 minutes till the hour. So let me pop down here. I have to have the right slide or it doesn't work. Here we go. Ah, yes, questions. You can type your question into the chat. You can just raise your hand or just unmute yourself and speak out if nobody else is talking. Any questions or opinions to share? Let's see here. I'm gonna scan through our audience, see if we got any hands raised. I have maybe a question, but it's more of an observation. This year, we have a group of people who are extraordinarily religious, and their reality is very strict. And what do you do with somebody who does not wish to look beyond a very, very narrow scope of beliefs?
Wow.
Well, one thing I think would be to see if you can get agreement with them about some of these things we just talked about. Like, would you agree that good health care is desirable or good education systems or support of stable families? Of course, it depends on what you're trying to do. Are you trying to persuade them to do something that they're not doing, or uh, do you have a particular objective in mind that would be part of or why would
No,
you do that?
more like well, again, it being pan-determined and not villainizing anybody. But if someone has a different ideal scene than you regarding what is good health care, what is a stable society, what is good education and what should be included in it. This is really tricky because sometimes the reality of certain groups is very different from other groups. I
Mm-hmm.
mean, this is why we have public schools, yet we also have private schools that are run by different religions and things like that. So we have
Yeah,
a different R in the ideal scene, really. And yeah, just
but I think you could probably
yeah.
still get agreement about. Well, I think we could agree that we want the best education for our children. Now, we might
Mhm.
disagree about how to go about that, like,
The
you know, getting that,
mhm.
but we would agree that our children should be well educated to be able to read and communicate and perform basic skills. So that's what I would do is search for areas that can be agreed upon, you know.
Yeah, and it also it's like what you're referring to there really is also part of the GPM bank, which is surf and fixed ideas.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, surf are the handmaiden of Eve Perps, but they don't quite go that far. So you can have social personalities that can have lots of fixed ideas and surf and so one of the it's a way of being right about things and having a certainty that's based on some authority, like with very religious people, for example, in what you were saying there. Um, why do they believe what they believe? Well, because that's what God says, and you can't argue with God. That's the ultimate trump card.
Mhm.
Like,
Yeah.
I'm playing the God card. Okay, that's the end of the discussion.
It is. It's like
Yay.
there's a
But
whole lot of righteousness happening there. Yeah,
yeah.
yep.
But
Oh dear. It's
even
tough.
people like that have practical issues that can be discussed, So in other words, I think Randy's exactly right. You can still find points of agreement, even if very general.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah. Just find that nugget of of social personality
Mm-hmm.
and
Yeah.
rationality. That would make sense, yes.
Right,
Good.
and the key thing is you don't have to agree with what they think. You just have to acknowledge what they say. And that way you
Mm-hmm.
can maintain a calm cycle, you can maintain ARC, and even with somebody who's going to never change their mind because it's all coming from an authority that can't be questioned.
Right.
Right. Exactly. Awesome. Are there any other comments or questions?
Or
Hope I
we can
didn't
open it
miss
up to
anybody.
wins too, wins. Who would like to share a win
Yes. Yes.
of any kind? I heard Tony laughing up there. Tony, you've got wins you'd like to share, I think.
I'll call myself the Wind Master. No.
Yay.
So after finishing with no questions about it at all, no reservations, blah, 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 blah,